Michael Jackson was 9, and Motown didn't want him. The head of the label said one sentence: "I ain't signing no kids." So another man put 5 children in his car and drove them to Detroit. They lived in his house for weeks. His name was taken off the story, and a lie was put in its place. Before we get to Chicago, you need to know how many times they had already been told no. In August 1967, the Jackson 5 won the amateur night competition at the Apollo in Harlem. Gladys Knight was there. She was already a Motown artist, and she was impressed enough to send a demo tape of these children to her own label. Motown rejected it. They posted the tape back to Gary, Indiana. The same year, they recorded an early version of a song called Big Boy for a Chicago label called Wonderful Records. That label turned them down too. In November 1967, Joe signed them to Steel Town Records, a tiny local outfit in Gary. Big Boy came out on January 30th, 1968, and got some airplay around Gary. Tito described what that felt like years later. He said it felt good to have a single out, that it made them feel like they were getting somewhere. And then he added the part that stays with you. But we didn't realize what a small level we were at in Gary compared to the world. And during that same period, to bring in extra money, Joe had his children performing in strip clubs. Michael was 9 years old. He described those rooms himself years later, and he never described them as glamorous. He said they were doing club dates at 3 in the morning. He said the striptease acts would come on after them, meaning the children were the warm-up and the audience was waiting for something else. He also said that in that period, he had no friends. His words: "I didn't have any friends when I was little. My brothers were my friends." So picture the actual arrangement. A 9-year-old in a nightclub at 3 in the morning on a school night, singing to a room of adults who were there for the act that followed him. Then back in the van. Then school. That was the job before Motown. Not a stage, not an audience there for him. A slot to be filled before the real show started. That was the situation in the summer of 1968. Rejected by Motown. Rejected by Wonderful, a local single that never left the county, and 5 brothers working nightclubs where they were the warm-up for something else entirely. Now let me start with the night that changed it, because it lasted about 8 minutes. July 17th, 1968, the Regal Theater in Chicago. A soul group called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers were headlining. They'd had a hit that year. They were the reason people bought tickets. The opening act was a family group from Gary, Indiana, 5 brothers. The youngest was 9 years old. They sang 2 songs. That was the whole set. 2 songs in front of a crowd who had come to see somebody else. If you want to keep hearing the stories nobody tells, subscribe before we go further. Because the man standing in the wings that night said something afterwards that almost nobody has heard. It's worth knowing who was standing in those wings, because he was not a talent scout. Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers were a soul band out of Vancouver, Canada, which made them unusual at Motown from the start. They'd signed to Gordy's label in 1968 and had a top 30 hit that year with "Does Your Mama Know About Me?" Taylor had also auditioned to replace David Ruffin as lead singer of The Temptations and lost the job to Dennis Edwards. So he was a working singer with a hit, a man who had come close to one of the biggest gigs in music and missed it, headlining a theater in Chicago, and a 9-year-old opened for him. Bobby Taylor described the moment in an interview years later, and he described it as a physical reaction. He said he saw this little kid spinning and stuff, and his response was immediate. "Dang, send him upstairs. When he finishes, I want to talk to this kid." He talked about it again in 2016, aged 82. He said Michael was up there singing his heart out, spinning around like James Brown. He said the boy was probably 8 at the time, but he was fully developed as a professional singer. And then this. I've never seen anything like him before or since. Bobby Taylor had spent his life around singers. He'd been at Motown through its best years. He'd auditioned to replace David Ruffin in The Temptations. He had seen everybody, and he said that. Now here's what he did about it, and it's the part that gets left out. He didn't make a phone call. He didn't pass a name along to somebody. He packed the 5 boys and their father into his car and drove them from Chicago to Detroit to his own house. They lived with him for several weeks. He rehearsed them himself in his home, getting them ready for an audition that hadn't been agreed to yet. Wait, don't miss this, because there was a reason it hadn't been agreed to. The head of Motown had already said no. Berry Gordy ran Motown. Nothing happened without him. Taylor tried to get him to look at the group, and Taylor has repeated Gordy's answer for the rest of his life, word for word. "I ain't signing no kids." That was it. That was the response to Michael Jackson. Gordy already had young acts. He had a business to run. Children were complicated. Schooling, guardians, contracts, parents. He wasn't interested. Taylor went around him. He phoned Ralph Seltzer, who ran Motown's creative department, and pushed for an audition. He introduced Joe and the boys to a young creative assistant at the label called Suzanne DePass, who then took the case to Gordy herself. Between them, they got him to agree. Wait, don't miss this, because at the exact moment that audition was arranged, the Jackson 5 had already been offered something bigger, and they turned it down. They had an invitation to appear on the David Frost Show in New York. National television. Their debut in front of the whole country. For a group who had never been seen outside Gary and Chicago, that was the biggest thing that had ever been offered to them. Joe canceled it. He canceled it because Bobby Taylor asked them to come to Detroit instead and record an audition tape for a man who had already turned them down twice. That is the decision the entire story turns on. National television, or a car journey to Detroit for a maybe. They chose the maybe. On July 23, 1968, Joe and a family friend drove the boys from Chicago to Detroit in the family's Volkswagen minibus. They arrived at Hitsville on Woodward Avenue and were met at the door by Suzanne DePass and Ralph Seltzer. And the man whose signature mattered was not in the building. He was in Los Angeles. The audition was filmed instead. Think about that for a second. The most consequential audition in the history of popular music was performed to a camera and a handful of executives, and the one person who could say yes watched it later, on tape, in another state. Michael was 9, Marlon 11, Jermaine 14, Tito 15, Jackie 17. One of the songs they performed that day was Who's Lovin' You, a Smokey Robinson song about heartbreak and regret, sung by a child who had not yet turned 10. Gordy watched the tape, and according to Motown's own history, he turned them down again. That's the third refusal. The demo in 1967, and now the film. He had Stevie Wonder already. He did not want another child act, and a tape of 5 boys in Detroit did not change that. Then something in it got to him. Accounts point to one thing in particular. On that tape, Michael does an impersonation of James Brown. 9 years old, doing the spins, doing the drops, doing all of it, in a rehearsal room in front of a camera. Gordy changed his mind. Here's what nobody told you, because of how fast he moved once he did. 3 days later, on July 26th, he was in Detroit. He had Joe and the boys sign their first Motown contract, a 1-year deal in person. 3 days. From a man who had said no 3 times. The full 7-year contract came on March 11th, 1969, once Motown had negotiated them out of their Steeltown deal. That was the day before Marlon's 12th birthday, and while those negotiations dragged on, the boys kept working the strip clubs to bring money in. They were signed to the biggest label in black music and still doing the same gigs, because the paperwork hadn't cleared. Ask yourself how thin that thread is. One man in Chicago decides to talk to a kid. One car journey, one house, one tape sent to a man who had already said no. They were signed on March 11th, 1969. Bobby Taylor became their first producer. He took them into Hitsville in Detroit, put them with the Funk Brothers, the house band that played on nearly every Motown record you know, and started recording. He produced most of their first album, soul covers, older material, songs he thought suited them, including that version of Who's Lovin' You. If you've ever heard that recording, a 9-year-old singing a grown man's song about loss and meaning every syllable of it, that was Bobby Taylor's session. Then Berry Gordy listened to what Taylor had made. Here's what nobody told you. Because Gordy's verdict on that work was 2 words long, and it ended Taylor's role. Old-fashioned. Gordy felt the material Taylor was producing was too old-fashioned for the group. He wanted something else, something new, bright, engineered. So he moved the Jacksons to California and took personal control of their sound. He assembled a writing and production team known as the Corporation. Freddie Perrin, Alfonso Mizell, Deke Richards, and himself. They took a song originally written for Gladys Knight, reworked it, and gave it to the boys. That song was I Want You Back. It went to number 1. So did the next 3. Bobby Taylor followed them to California briefly, but he received no credit on I Want You Back, no credit on ABC, no credit on the records that made them the biggest new act in the world. The man who found them drove them, housed them, rehearsed them, and produced their first sessions, was moved aside before the first single came out. And then came the part that is difficult to describe as anything other than a rewrite. Motown had to launch this group. They needed a story, something clean, glamorous, and easy for the press to print. So in August 1969, Motown's publicity operation decided that Diana Ross had discovered the Jackson 5. And here is the detail that makes it worse. That PR effort was led by Suzanne DePass, the same Suzanne DePass that Bobby Taylor had personally introduced them to, the one who took their case to Berry Gordy when he wasn't interested, the one who met them at the door of Hitsville the day of the audition. She knew exactly who had found them. She had been in the room. She hadn't. She had nothing to do with finding them. Motown's own museum credits Bobby Taylor with bringing them in. But Diana Ross was the biggest star the label had, and attaching a new act to her was smart business. The first Jackson 5 album was released in December 1969 under the title Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5. Her name is on the front of it. His isn't anywhere. And here's the thing no one ever talks about. Diana Ross did do something real for them, and the lie has buried that too. In August 1969, Diana Ross hosted a media launch in Beverly Hills to present the group to the industry. Days later, they opened for her at the Los Angeles Forum. That mattered. That was a genuine leg up, and she gave it to them. She just didn't discover them. The invented story didn't only erase Bobby Taylor, it flattened what she actually did into something fictional, so that even her real contribution became part of a press release. Nobody in that arrangement got the truth. Not the man who found them, and not the woman who helped launch them. Bobby Taylor's own career never recovered. Motown shifted him to VIP, one of its smaller imprints. His solo singles didn't sell. One of them, Oh, I've Been Blessed, picked up a cult following years later, long after it could have made any difference to him. The band he'd fronted broke up. The hit he'd had faded. And the group he'd found went on to become, within 18 months, the biggest new act in the world. But he kept working, and this is the part I keep coming back to. He didn't disappear into bitterness. He produced records. He mentored young artists. He performed at festivals and clubs and on television in his 70s, in whatever country would have him. At 82, he was still traveling to produce new music. He was working on a project he described as a musical plea for tolerance, peace, empathy, and creativity. He eventually settled in Hong Kong and lived there for years, half a world away from Detroit. Don't miss this, because of when he died and what almost every obituary had to explain. Bobby Taylor died on July 22, 2017, in a hospital in Hong Kong. He was being treated for leukemia. He was 78 or 83, depending on which record you believe. Even that isn't settled. He died one day short of the 49th anniversary of the audition he arranged. And here is what happened in the press. Rolling Stone, Billboard, and nearly every obituary published that week carried some version of the same sentence. Although Motown and the Jacksons credited Diana Ross with discovering the Jackson Five, it was Taylor who found them. They had to correct the record in his obituary. That's what it took. He was alive for 49 years after that night in Chicago, and the fix only ran when he was dead, in the paragraph explaining who he had been. There's one more detail, and it's a small one, and it stays with me. When Taylor drove the boys to Detroit, he took Joe Jackson too. He didn't have to. He could have taken the act and left the father in Gary. Plenty of people in that industry would have. He housed all of them for weeks before there was any deal, any contract, any guarantee that Gordy would even look at the tape. He was not owed anything by those children. He had a career of his own that was going well. Their success would eventually eclipse his own completely, and he must have known even then that it might. He did it anyway. So here's the ledger. Michael Jackson sang 2 songs as an opening act in 1968, and one man in the wings understood immediately what he was looking at. That man drove him to another state, put him up in his own house, rehearsed him, got him in front of a camera when the boss had already said no, and produced the first recordings of his life. The boss called that work old-fashioned and replaced him. The publicity department gave the credit to somebody else. The album carried her name. The hits carried other people's names. And the correction ran in 2017 in his obituary. Michael Jackson became the most famous person on earth. Berry Gordy is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Diana Ross is a legend and deserves to be. Bobby Taylor died in a hospital in Hong Kong and had to have his own life explained posthumously by journalists. He never seemed bitter about it in interviews. He talked about that night in Chicago with obvious joy, right up to the end, and he never stopped saying the same thing about the boy he saw spinning on that stage. I've never seen anything like him before or since. He was right. Nobody has. He just didn't get to be the one who said it first.